It's indeed our pleasure and delight to welcome two of our very dear friends, Professor Ramkishan Rajan, who is a professor at George Mason University. Professor Rajan is not only a professor at George Mason, but he actually grew up in Singapore. And he was an assistant professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School before he went to George Mason. And he spent considerable amount of time in Australia, and he has a lot of interest not only in India but also in developing economies and Asia Pacific. So I think because of the geography of his evolution, he could not really escape Asia and the Pacific. And he has taught in Australia, he has taught in Singapore, and now he is a tenured professor at George Mason University. So he is an American professor, but he feels a lot like one of us because he also spends a lot of time in Singapore these days. By way of introduction, the other point that I want to add before because I did promise him that he said, you know, the introduction should be short. And I said, I'll take 2 minutes. And then he said, no, you should take 1. But I think I'll take 3. And because every seat has its privileges, right? And you should be able to exploit the few privileges that you have. So the other interesting facet about this seminar is that one of our former research associates, and we have some sitting with us over here, Shashidharan, Sasi, is with us as a co-author with Kishan. And I remember him as a young boy who, I would call him a boy, although he might mind this one. He still looks like a boy, although he's wearing a suit, but at that time he did look like a boy and very energetic and all of that, and I'm sure he was part of the ISAS family, some of whom are present here. And he was very hardworking. He convinced Kishan enough to earn a scholarship to get a PhD from George Mason University. And now he is a postdoctoral fellow at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So we are doubly privileged to have amongst us one of our former colleagues who is still a colleague because he has a position at the LKY school, and amongst us one of our former colleagues who is not our colleague at this point in time but has come in a different incarnation. Beyond that, I don't want to say anything about the topic because I'm sure you'll hear a lot about the topic from Kishan and from Shashi, except saying that it is a very important one for us. A serious paper written by a serious scholar on FDI flows into the BRICS. What do they originate from? Over to you, Kishan and Shashi.
Thank you, Rahul. Nice to be back here after a long hiatus. I'm not one for great introductions, so let me just get straight into the topic, given limited time, etc. So what I'll do, I will, how do I, is it a point this, doesn't?
I think, you know, you probably have to stand. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. It's working. Okay, so, yeah, so that's fine. So it's a small enough room. I feel like some really important decisions on the South Asian region are made here, sort of like cabinet room. But stop me, I'm going to keep it fairly informal. Stop me if you have any questions. What I'd like to do is the following. This this presentation is based on a sort of a series of papers that Sasi, I, and some other co-authors have been doing. I wouldn't call our work on FDI sort of our core area. It's one of those nagging areas of interest that we keep coming back to. Actually, we started doing this, and to give you a quick sense, when you think about work on FDI by economists, they're broadly, I'm generalizing, they're broadly two types, right? The policy walks will talk about the legal regulatory issues, why FDI is not coming into countries like India or is slowed down, etc. And the sort of leaving out the theory folks, the empirical folks. And the empirical folks broadly look at two aspects: determinants of FDI and effects of FDI. When you think about effects of FDI, what does FDI do in terms of exports? What does it do in terms of technology transfer, growth, etc. Right? We have done quite a bit of work early on determinants of FDI. And one of the interesting things about determinants of FDI, reason why that interest has grown so significantly is last few years, I say few, 6, 7 years, we have got some good bilateral data on FDI. So we can do nice empirics, and which Sasi, I, and others have done. One of the problems when you start looking at bilateral FDI flows, you have a big problem, right? Because you say, well, 50% of FDI is to India is from Mauritius, or now it's 25, India and Mauritius. But we have real problems in terms of transshipping, right? The trade parallel with its sort of trade deflection, and then we also have the round tripping issue. So the minute you start getting into bilateral data, so it's nice to have bilateral data to do empirical stuff, but then you have all these problems with bilateral data. So that sort of got a lot of empirical folks just take it as it is and don't worry too much about it. But we sort of started getting very interested in this and said, can we go beyond just this bilateral data and sort of do some snooping around, try and figure out where some of this FDI is actually originating from. Okay, that's how we started getting interested in this topic. The reason why, and so that was a few years ago. More recently, the reason why we came back to this topic is a month or so ago, we were in Delhi. DIPP had organized or co-organized a seminar, and there's a big issue, or has been a big issue in India, about FDI in the pharma industry. Right? And so one of the concerns is, well, a lot of FDI is coming into India, but it's going to the pharma industry, but very little of that is greenfield investment. It's in the form of mergers and acquisitions. And then there's a question about is it helpful? What happens if they reduce their R&D capacity? What happens if they stop making generic drugs, etc.? So that was the context, right? And so DIPP had this thing where they said 96% of FDI in pharma, and I'm not going to talk about sectors here, but just to give you a sense, 96% of FDI in the pharma industry is M&A. I asked them, where do you get this data from? You can't get data like that. I mean, unless you sort of do a field study or whatever. We have some M&A data, and I'll talk about that. We have FDI data, but it's very hard to put the two together and say 96%, not even 95, 96%, right? And so that sort of picked our interest again, so we've come back to this topic. So let me, I guess I should be standing up from there. Okay. All right, so in terms of structure, I'll do the first three. Maybe I should, if you don't mind. So I'll do the first three, the prelims, and I want to spend some time talking about definitions, talk about the global trends and patterns, a bit about BRICS, and then Sasi, who's far more systematic and organized, he'll take you through to with all the pie charts and the data for individual BRICS. I think given the time limitations, we'll probably focus much more on India, and that's also because India is the case where we actually we have actually gone to the RBI sources, DIPP sources, so we have much better handle of it than we do for Brazil, Russia, China, but we will start looking at the local sources for those countries. Okay? So just very quickly, some of you know about this, but it's important to understand. Foreign direct investment is not investment per se, it's not physical investment, right? It's a source of external financing. Remember, portfolio, equity, and debt, meaning bonds, bank flows and remittances are other forms of external financing. When we think about FDI, there are three aspects of FDI: new equity flows, intra-company debt transactions, reinvested earnings. This hardly any work is done on intra-company debt transactions, and we don't have very good data on that. Most people just focus on FDI full stop. My point here today is to emphasize FDI versus M&A. Okay, and I want to get to that. But before I do that, the other interesting area that Sasi and I started looking at is reinvested earnings, right? And the reason why we're looking at it is, if you look at this UNCTAD data, this is not specifically for BRICS, but UNCTAD data, about, what do we have? About 2/5 of FDI into developing countries is reinvested earnings itself. A lot of focus by policymakers is how do we attract investment into the country, and implicitly a lot of that is how do we get new multinationals, etc., to come in. Much less attention is being paid to existing foreign direct investors. How do you make sure that they are happy? How do they, to get them to reinvest their earnings into the country? Again, for developing countries, it's quite big. If you look at ASEAN, Secretariat data for ASEAN as a whole, it's also about 1/3. If you look at, this is India data, and if you look at India data, it's about 1/4 to 1/3 of FDI into India is reinvested earnings. You look at this, you wonder, oh, well, what's going on here? It's not so much about, we don't have rates of growth here, but it's not about a decline in reinvested earnings per se. It was really 2002, 2003 to about 2008 was the bullish period for India in terms of FDI. Generally, it was going up. A lot of new equity flows were coming coming in. So reinvested earnings were growing, but not nearly as fast as new equity flows. New equity flows being greenfield and FDI. Okay, but anyway, just so anyone who's interested in this issue from a research perspective, this is actually a very interesting and under-researched area, reinvested earnings. And we have some good data on it. We have started looking at it. But so leaving that aside, so we don't have much data on debt. We leave out reinvested earnings. Focus really on new equity flows. So when we think about new equity flows, we think we have greenfield investment and mergers and acquisitions, right? Again, greenfield, setting up a new company. That's what we think about. Most people still, when they think about FDI, they think MNC or whatever's coming in and setting up a new company or whatever subsidiary there, but it doesn't have to be. It could be in the form of mergers and acquisitions. If you look at the data, so UNCTAD gives us data on overall FDI. When you look at data on, you want to get data on the two subcomponents, well, you have some data on greenfield investment from FT Limited. Very few people look at this. You know, FT Limited is basically, you know, those of you who read the FDI magazine, that's where it comes from. The problem with greenfield data, and that's why we don't use it, is really announcement of projects as opposed to actualization. We don't know the realization ratio, the proportion of announced projects that are actually realized. So we don't really use that data. But M&A data are pretty good. Thomson, Delogic, etc., Bloomberg have some good M&A data. But there are some problems with M&A data. Not all FDI data, not all M&A is FDI because you have greenfield investment, obviously. But even then, if you look at M&A data, there's some problems here. When Delogic, Thomson, etc. talk about M&A, they don't necessarily use the threshold that we have for foreign direct investment. The foreign direct investment threshold is 10% and over, right? So they don't always say 10%. Bloomberg, for instance, says 2, 3%, whatever. But that's easy enough to solve. You can just take the M&A data, you take the threshold over 10%, and you can sieve out the rest of it. That's not so much of a problem. There are some bigger problems. M&A data doesn't necessarily result in actual capital flow. It may not be actual financing because it could be a swapping of shares. This is a big problem, right? So M&A data may not actually be actual capital flows per se. The other big problem is M&A data is when M&A is announced or realized, say the deal is 100 million, that's when it's stated as 100 million. But in actual fact, 50 million could come today, 50 million tomorrow. So the FDI data will show you 50 and 50 today and tomorrow. M&A data shows up 100 million, right? And so that's a problem. But the other issue, of course, because M&A, you can't take FDI, even without all of these issues, you can't take FDI minus M&A to get greenfield because you have the other reinvested earnings component. Okay, so there are some issues. Good data, but there are some issues. We've done very quickly, Sasi will talk about India specifically, but we've sort of got into this India data in a bit more detail. I just want to give you some sense here. So this is, so like I said, aggregate FDI minus aggregate M&A is not aggregate greenfield, right? Because you have the retained earnings component, you have the other debt transactions, other small capital, but for India's numbers, this is very small, so it's very negligible. Staggered investment, like I talked about, right? Swapping of shares, round tripping, etc. To try and to sort this out, what we have done is we have said, okay, let's take out India's FDI numbers. Let's take out the retained earnings component, right? So RBI data will give you equity investment, retained earnings, etc. So we just take the equity investment. So the FDI here doesn't have retained earnings. So that we can take that part out. To deal with staggered investment, rather than looking at every year, we take a 3-year moving average, right? So sort of to stagger it out. You can do 5 years, whatever, but to smooth it out. So that we can do. But we can't do anything about the swapping of shares and round tripping, okay? But we don't have good data on that. We're actually starting to do some guesstimates on round tripping, but I'll leave that for later. But in any case, this gives us some sense. Notice this sort of, we have a longer time series, but there's some degree of correlation here. You see sort of this equity, this is M&A. The difference, again, is not exactly greenfield. It could be swapping of shares, but round tripping, but it's closer than most other people have in terms of looking at the data. But that's how you would start snooping and try and get a sense of the data. Now, but this is aggregate. Once you start looking at bilateral FDI, you have this other big problem that I alluded to before, which is not the transshipping problem. Right? So if I start looking at FDI between whatever US and India, well, the actual bilateral data may be significantly understating the extent of bilateral investment linkages because some of it may be transshipped through Mauritius, Singapore, etc. And that's the other big problem with the bilateral data. So you aggregate you can do some of this, but with bilateral, you can't just do this because of this big transshipping problem. And the large part of what we're doing is to try and get a sense of that transshipping issue. I'm going to skip this thing here. Why do we care about greenfield, M&A, etc.? Without getting into this in any really sophisticated way, let's just think about this basic thing. All of us who have done basic economics will have been told the two following things, two identities: balance of payments accounting identity and national income accounting identity. Capital, forget reserves, etc. The financial or capital account plus the current account must be equal to 0. Balance of payments must balance, and the current account must equal national savings minus investment. Therefore, minus current. So financial or capital account equals minus current account, and the current account is minus current account is investment versus investment minus national savings. So just think about this issue. Let's say everything is 0 to begin with. $10 of FDI comes into the country. Okay, Japanese company comes in, puts in $10 into India, sets a new company. So the capital account plus $10. Okay, current account must be minus 10. How does it work in terms of greenfield investment? Investment rates go up $10. Okay, so the capital account is $10. Investment exceeds national savings by $10. So the capital account equals minus current account. No problem. FDI, greenfield investment, very straightforward. But what if it's M&A? Japanese company buys an existing company in India. Capital account or financial account goes up by $10. Change of ownership in and of itself doesn't necessarily have to imply an increase in investment. It could lead to an increase in investment if you have a company that's sort of dying and the Japanese company comes in and then chooses to increase its domestic investment, but they may or may not, right? But that's one possibility. If they do that, yes, investment goes up. Okay? Or they could say, well, I don't increase, I just buy up whatever, there's a transfer of ownership. The existing owners who have got the money, they choose to reinvest domestically, then again, investment rates could go up. But that's an if, unlike greenfield investment. The existing owners could just as easily say, okay, I have $10, I'm going to take this $10 and consume more. Remember, savings are defined as that part of national income that is not consumed. National savings haven't changed because it's just a transfer of ownership. Consumption goes up, therefore national savings comes down. So you have a situation now, $10 comes in, financial account plus $10. Nothing happened to investment rates, but national savings comes down by $10. So the two balance out. So M&A, again, the two have to balance, but the way it could balance is through a decrease in national savings or an increase in investment, but we are not sure. Or you could have a situation where transfer of ownership, I'm the owner in India, I get $10, I say, well, there are not very many lucrative investment opportunities that I see in India, I take the money overseas, I send the money overseas. So what you have, investment rate doesn't change, national savings doesn't change, therefore the current account doesn't change, therefore the capital account must not change. What has happened? Plus $10 of FDI, minus $10 capital outflow. So even in this very simple setting, and forget about all this secondary effects in terms of M&A there could be restructuring and restructuring the company, etc. Quite possible. All I'm saying is just in this very basic level, the type of FDI matters. It's not just the quantum of FDI. We just look at the overall numbers. But greenfield versus M&A, the type of FDI matters. I'm not saying M&A is not important, not useful. It's just more the macroeconomic and development consequences are much more complex than greenfield investment. Okay, so just to, it's an important, I'll skip this because of interest of time. So just again, definitions and just some basic concepts. Let's very quickly talk about global trends. This is nothing fancy. This is just, if anyone who follows UNCTAD World Investment Report knows of this data. But if you look at, sort of, you had two peaks. We had a peak just before a dot-com bubble collapse globally, and then we had the next peak just before the global financial crisis. Not very surprising. What's interesting is after that, up to available data to 2013, there's been sort of recovery at 2013 back to the pre-dot-com peak and pre-global financial peak, but not sort of, we haven't reached the highs that we had in 2008. Okay, but now if you look at the developed versus developing countries, what you notice is actually developing countries have reached new highs. It's really the developed countries that have not. Okay, and so what we have for the first time is the share of global FDI, developing and transition economies share is fairly small, so it's predominantly developing countries, have overtaken developed countries. So historically the share was something like 70-30, okay, on average before in the 1990s. Now it's about 60-40. So 70 used to be developed country, 30 used to be developing country. Now we have 60 developing country, 40 developed country. Okay, so really the global FDI numbers are hiding the fact that it's really the developed countries that are not getting as much gross FDI inflows compared to before. Developing countries are. This is just telling you of the countries. The only point here is sort of BRICS show, obviously US, but then you have China, Brazil, Russia, and India show up here. Okay, so our focus really is on BRICS. If you look at M&A data, this again, two are not directly comparable, so I'm not taking M&A minus FDI to give you green field, but as long as you say these errors are consistent through, meaning swapping of shares, round tripping, etc., they don't change over time, the ratios are telling us something, and on average we find, globally at least, the share of M&A to FDI is about 50%. So again, it's not non-negligible. So again, we think FDI, we think greenfield, we think how FDI is such a stable form of financing compared to portfolio flows and everything else. Well, think about M&A. What's the difference between mergers and acquisition versus equity, portfolio equity investment? The big difference is the threshold. 9.9% in the balance of payment shows up as foreign portfolio investment. 10.1 shows up as M&A. Are they such different animals? I mean, there's been some work suggesting actually M&A is driven by very similar things that portfolio investment would be driven by. High liquidity, risk levels, etc. Right? And so, yes, I can understand if you say M&A or equity investment of 70% or 60% compared to portfolio investment of 5%, yes, they're different. Okay? But one has to be nuanced about this. Okay? It's not just a matter of FDI is very stable and a great and a panacea for everything compared to other types of capital flows. So again, those of you interested in global stuff can look at the UNCTAD World Investment Report, but let's focus more on the BRICS here. And so if you look at the BRICS share, so a BRICS share used to be about, what's it here, about 13% or so. It's been rising it's been rising gradually from 2007 to about one-fifth of the share of global share of FDI is going to BRICS. Within BRICS, yes, China dominates. China, about 2/5 of the investment into BRICS is to China. But what's interesting is China's share of BRICS has been coming down. Okay? In the early stages, it used to be about 70%. Now it's about 2/5. Okay? So Brazil, Russia, and India. So India's share has grown. It's still fairly small, but India's share of this is about 10%. Okay? Then you have Brazil, etc. Now, if you look at the type of investment, and this is one of the key takeaways, right? So type of investment is important, not just FDI. You look at the type of investment, and again, this is announced because it's the best we have, announced from that FT thing, just to give us a sense. The BRICS countries, it's been fairly stagnant and coming down for, you can't just, 1 year doesn't tell us very much, but it's been fairly stagnant. What's been going up, really, for the BRICS is the M&A share. Okay, so BRICS share of FDI has been going up. At least the announced greenfield is not changing very much, been fairly stagnant. So what's actually been going up for the BRICS has been the M&A share. And if you look at this, and this is where, again, countries, one has to differentiate countries like India versus China. It's not just a matter of the quantum of FDI. It's the share. India gets a much larger share of FDI in the form of M&A than China does. Is that a sign of strength of India's financial markets or a sign of weakness in terms of investors don't want to put in nearly as much greenfield investment? Don't know. But the fact is there's a lot more, India and Brazil, much relative to China certainly and Russia, much larger share of M&A to FDI. Again, I'm not saying exactly M&A as a share of FDI is 70%, therefore 30% is greenfield, right? Because we said the two aren't comparable. But if you look at it across countries, it's telling us something, right? M&A share of, because the same data sources. Where did you want to start from here? Okay, so I'll just do one more slide and I'll stop. Okay, so having done all this to give you a sense, the type of FDI matters. I hope I've convinced you that's important. So now the question is, what we want to look at is the source of FDI. Where is it coming from? And so now we want to move from aggregate to bilateral. You could ask, well, why do we care, right? Well, apart from just academic interest, it's actually important. If you think about international trade, when people think about international trade and testing of international trade theories, one of the first things we do is take out entrepot trade, because that sort of contaminates the data, as it were. Same thing here. If I have a theory of bilateral FDI flows, but a large part of the FDI flows are being round tripping or transshipping, etc., I'm not going to be able to test my theory well, okay, because it distorts the data. It's important in terms of policy deliberations, etc. So when we talk about, oh, well, US investment in India, US is only about a 10%, has a 10% share of FDI into India. It's a marginal player. But if a large chunk of that is being transshipped through Mauritius, Singapore, etc., actually, US plays a much bigger role in India than the data, bilateral data, FDI might suggest. Okay, so it's important. That also becomes important from a political economy. Rahul's an expert on this. I'm not. But when you think about, if I'm trying to lobby US senators, Congress, etc., then they say, well, why do we care? Well, you are in the amount of FDI going into India is fairly small. But the bilateral data may show it's small, but actually it's not. It's much larger. And we have to also worry about that because we have to worry about transshipping and round tripping for tax and transparency reasons. Okay, that's why sort of we have to care about this.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Good to be back. I'll just jump right into it. So as Kishan was talking about earlier about the importance of assessing bilateral FDI inflows and the kind of problems that we are facing with the data, I think taking off from the last point, right, we need to understand the extent of round tripping and transshipping for obvious reasons in terms of taxation and its implications on India. Now, the major portion of the data is that if you actually look at very closely at the bilateral level, we see a lot of OFCs and tax havens represent a disproportionate share of these bilateral flows, and that is that's not a very useful composition. It's not a very useful share because it doesn't tell you much when you see a country like Mauritius or other tax havens show up very significantly in terms of the leading source of investor in a particular country. So and that's the point I want to emphasize here before we move on. We need to make a distinction between OFCs and tax havens, number one. People talk as if they are the same, but if you actually even read this definition, it may look as if they are the same, but the key distinction is that you don't have, tax havens do not have to be financing centers of financial centers. And so except for the fact that both tax havens and OFCs have low tax jurisdictions, they are different. And also it's important from an Asian standpoint, mainly because you see most countries like Hong Kong and Singapore are classified as OFCs and not as tax havens. So that's useful to keep that definition in mind as we move forward. And also another reason why it's becoming important is, why we need to care about OFCs in terms of FDI flows is because they've been rising in terms of their importance, in terms of the shares of FDI flows coming from these offshore financing centers have been at historically high peaks, and especially after 2007 of the global financial crisis, we see a significant jump. If you look at, give or take about 8% or so in terms of the share of the world, in terms of what OFCs play, but if you look at just the developing countries proposition, it's about 15%, which is not a negligible number. So it is important to care about the OFCs and the shares that are rerouted through these destinations. So anyway, that's just to set the floor, and then now what we're going to do in the remainder of the paper is essentially to understand the de facto real linkages between on a bilateral basis for the BRICS economies vis-a-vis the world by looking at bilateral FDI data, right? And as was earlier mentioned, we were trying to actually reconcile FDI data with M&A data in order to, of course, with all the caveats, keeping in mind what are the problems with M&A data and comparing the two, we are trying to propose an alternative framework by examining M&As, which could perhaps be much more meaningful in giving us a better geographic distribution of where or who is doing the investments, and for the reasons outlined earlier as to why it's important to care about such a decomposition, right? So in terms of the data sources, we are looking at UNCTAD for bilateral FDI, which is the most reliable source so far, and we have restricted, the data is restricted to 2012, so we are stopping it there. And then for M&As, it's all proprietary information, so you have to depend on private sources, but Dealogic seems to be by far the most comprehensive that we have managed to lay our hands on, and so the latest available is 2014, so we'll be looking at, so all the country level information that we see here in terms of the M&As are from Dealogic, and all the FDI related information is from UNCTAD, right? That's the thing. So again, just a brief brush up, M&A data helps us tracks the actual ownership of purchase and sales. So the reason why we are trying to reconcile the FDI data with M&A is because we believe that by looking at M&A data, we'll be able to actually identify the sources of ownership as opposed to FDI data, which gives us just the flow of funds. It just tells you that it's coming from Mauritius, but it doesn't really tell you where it's originally originating from. So for that, it might be helpful to actually look at M&A data. And especially considering that M&A, there's been a rising proportion of M&As in terms of FDI, as we saw in the earlier charts, right? And also, it's important to keep in mind that we need to have a degree of comparability between the two. In order to maintain consistency, we have to look at equity stakes beyond 10% and above, to just be consistent with the definition of FDI, right? So we want to do that. So we set all these things before we actually download M&A data and start analyzing it, right? So now what we do is we have country case studies. India a little more detailed because we have access to other sources as well. And then we have for Brazil, Russia, and China, looking at their bilateral sources to see what are the sources and how do they compare when you actually present or go into M&A information, to see how they contrast and whether we see a different set of countries emerge, or whether they offer any meaningful insights or not. And that's what we're trying to get at, right? To give you a sense of where we're going. Just to, again, give you a broad background about what's going on with India. As we know, there's been slight momentum has been picking up since the early 2000s in terms of FDI inflows into the country, and it was the highest. The heyday was just before the financial crisis, right? 2008 was a peak, and it's lost ground since then. And if you actually look at the share in terms of the world FDI, in terms of the global FDI flows, it about 3% or so, give or take. 2008, 2009, it was averaging about 1.5% for the last 13 years or so. Now, if it's the same, actually, if you look at share of domestic capital formation, you see again 2008 emerging as an important year. It reached about 11% or so is your share of the domestic capital formation, right? That's before the global financial crisis. And then what we are interested in, before we move into specific country sources, just a couple of caveats about the data as it's presented to us. Whenever you try to actually look at bilateral FDI information or look for any information on India and FDI flows, there are several sources that come to you. But we have to be very careful in the way we define this, because there are differences, very subtle differences in the way they are reported, and each of them, actually, if you see, the numbers do not really add up. The numbers don't really match, but they don't match for a particular reason. That's the reason why, that's what we're trying to highlight here, right? So if you start from the bottom, the UNCTAD country fact sheet that you see, which is broadly representative of what FDI as we know it, I mean, which includes reinvested earnings, and that's the figure that we can broadly attribute as FDI, right? That's what. But if you look at the bilateral information, it doesn't really match with the country fact sheet information that's provided, mainly because it does not have the reinvested earnings component. It makes logical sense to leave out reinvested earnings out of this, because we're looking at a bilateral basis, and we don't really, we want to just compare only those flows between these countries and not the domestic component of it. So we are leaving behind reinvested earnings, and that's why you see these numbers that you see in bilateral FDI database lower than the country fact sheet numbers. Then if you look at the DIPP numbers, which again is a source to go to look at what is going on with India and India's FDI, they broadly match with the bilateral FDI database, but what happens is they actually include a component called acquisition of shares, which we believe is actually capturing part of mergers and acquisitions, but not entirely. So we try to reconcile that acquisition of shares, so-called acquisition of shares reported in DIPP, and we try to see whether it matches with the M&A data that we have from Dealogic. It's a lot of data digging, but then it doesn't really seem to match, but only part of it is captured. So that's where the discrepancy comes. I mean, that's why you see differences in all these different sources when the terms of the way they report FDI numbers. So we just have to keep that in mind. Of course, RBI is supposed to be the parent source for all these information, so you will find that information there as well.
So just to make sure, right? So the last row there, so that's the full internationally consistent
FDI.
definition of FDI, includes everything, retail earnings in particular, right? The one that's always sort of highlighted in India's newspapers, FDI to India, a certain amount, that's usually the DIPP numbers. So it includes an acquisition of shares component that we're still not sure what it is. RBI's definition, but it's not completely clear. But what it doesn't include is retained earnings, and that's so it's about 25%. So you look at the difference in DIPP and UNCTAD country fact sheets. That 25% or so is really retained earnings part. Yeah, that's not that. For some reason, they don't use that as the headline number. They should include retained earnings as well.
Yeah, thanks. So then, having said that, in terms of the different sources, now we look at comparing the FDI information and M&A information for each country, right? So what do we see? So this is the headline and figures that gets quoted all the time, right? We see tax havens and other OFCs like Netherlands constituting over half of FDI inflows on average over the last decade. And if you actually take on average, and within these tax havens, we see Mauritius taking the most share, or 95% or so. Within this 43%, it's all coming from Mauritius, and it's actually of limited use in trying to actually understand India's extent of bilateral linkages, right? And so, and this is a problem that we are faced with when we are just looking at bilateral sources without understanding who's doing the investing. So then what we do is to see if this actually gives us a better information, we try to reconcile this with M&A. But before we go there, the shares, given all the definitions that we talked about in terms of different sources and how they present FDI data, well, absolute values do not match. The country shares do actually match broadly between UNCTAD and DIPP information. So it's also important to note that Singapore and I mean, so this is just to show you that both from these two different sources we have broadly similar consistent shares, and they actually is reliable, right? Yeah. Financial year, yeah. And UNCTAD, because it bases on RBI, and RBI reports on financial year, and DIPP also does the same. So, right. So this is this to show that UNCTAD and DIPP are consistent. And then what we know is that what happened in 2013 and 14 is Singapore overtook Mauritius as the leading source of FDI inflows into India. And we know that a lot of Indian companies have been using offshore financing centers like Singapore and Netherlands as intermediaries to do a lot of purchases overseas, primarily in the developed world. And so for that reason, we see Singapore has emerged as overtook Mauritius as actually the leading source of FDI inflow. So this is, and if you actually go down a little bit in terms of sectors, we see most, on average, most services, construction, telecom, they all received about 40% of FDI over this last decade or so, and computers, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, all these make up another 16% of the FDI inflows broadly, right? Just to give an indicative sense of where the flows are going, which sectors are they flowing into, right? Now, this is just to reiterate again the point that there's been a growing share of M&A in terms of FDI when it comes to India. And if you actually take the same to iron out all the, to smooth out the data, we look at the moving averages and we compare the FDI inflows and inbound M&A acquisitions basically for the last, from 2001 to 2013, we see that there has been a broad rising trend in terms of ratio of M&A to FDI. Of course, there was a notable decline right after the financial crisis, but you still see a pickup again in this. So this is again to say that it's not unreasonable to compare M&A data with FDI, because we may have a better sense of who's doing the investing, and it's not really comparing apples and oranges. And that's the point we're trying to make. So now if you look at M&A data, you see some surprising results, and that's the whole basis for the paper, the data work, because you see that almost all the OFCs that we talked about, almost all the tax havens that we referred to disappear when you look at M&A information about who's actually doing it. You can see the table is comparing, that presents the FDI that we saw in the pie charts, and this pie chart gives you the M&A shares. So you see United States is the single largest acquirer of Indian companies, about 30% or so, and then UK emerges. All these usual suspects of our developed countries who are doing the investing in India seem to appear, and they seem to be consistent with logic that they are actually the main investors in our country, right, in India. And if you look at majority of the inbound acquisitions, again have been by the US, UK, Japan and Singapore also had lower shares compared to actually the FDI data that we have. Now, what this also suggests is one other important point, right? Because we started with the premise that FDI tracks only the flow of funds. It doesn't give you the actual ownership data. Now, most of these investments that have come from the US and the UK appears to have been routed through Mauritius. Appears to have been, which is why you see a disproportionate share in terms of Mauritius as the leading destination in the country, because we don't track good data when it comes to Mauritius. But if you look at the M&A data, you know that the guys who are doing the investing is from the US and the UK, and it's not Mauritius actually. So it seems to be like adding up in terms of in terms of consistency. It appears as if there significant shares, at least. I mean, we don't have data to exactly show that's how it has happened, but it seems to have been channeled particularly through Mauritius, because we know that one data tracks the ownership and the other data tracks the flow of funds, and so we can reconcile the two. Right. So that's the difference that you examine when you actually compare the two data. Right. And Again, just to give you a little bit of sense of what's going on in the sectors, whether there's any difference in terms of FDI into sectors in India and also M&A. You see healthcare, pharmaceutical has been the highest M&A share between in the last 3 or 4 years. It's been picked up significantly. It's about 18 to 20%, give or take. And this was, again, going back to the point that Kishan made earlier about pharmaceuticals, and a lot of discourse right now about whether it's advisable to allow M&A, FDI into pharma. And just to make a point that M&A has been significant in pharmaceuticals of late. Again, this is also to give you a sense of what is going on, because you have sectoral data as well in Dealogic. It's not just country information, but you can also go down to the sectors if you want and actually do some analysis. So this is that's what it permits us to do so. So we're getting share. So now that sums up about India. So the same trends, is it only unique to India? Is it a problem of Mauritius only to India? Is it also a problem of other emerging markets as well? So that's the reason why we wanted to expand this a little bit away from India and see whether Brazil, Russia, China do seem to give us a ballpark, at least very similar trends, or are they all different animals? And actually, when comparing, we did find that to a significant extent that the story is consistent across the board, especially, again, given that we see that the M&A to FDI ratio has been going up, specifically in Brazil and India, more than in Russia and China, and a comparison of the two tells us that the composition of countries who are doing the investing are different. So just to give you an overview of what has happened in Brazil and other emerging markets, you see the tax havens and OFCs, like especially Netherlands and Luxembourg, approximately about 35% or so comes from these countries as far as Brazil is concerned. And if you look at within the tax havens that's lumped up here, you see Cayman Islands again constitutes about half of the FDI inflows to Brazil, right? And British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, or other popular tax havens which through which money is flowing into Brazil. And if you look at M&A, again, in contrast, US, Japan, UK, even Spain are all top acquirers, making about 40% of inbound M&A acquisitions into these countries, into Brazil, in contrast to Luxembourg, tax haven, and the lump sum tax haven, and also Netherlands and other countries that we see in FDI. So what about Russia? Russia is also pretty similar. We see, again, tax havens and OFCs contribute about 60% on average, right? If you have a time trend, you still see a very significant share, right? And actually, if you Cyprus constitutes about half of the FDI inflows into Russia within the tax havens, as far as Russia is concerned. So every emerging market that you see has a particular tax haven or an offshore financing center from whom or from which country the flows have been routed into the particular country. And there has been, again, it's also been noted even by UNCTAD that the top 3 destinations of FDI flows from Russia have been like Cyprus, Netherlands, and British Virgin Islands coincide with the top 3 investors into Russia. So there's a lot of correlation between inward and outward FDI into Russia, and that's the round tripping part that we are talking about, right? So if you look at M&A in Russia, you see Germany, France emerge as, and UK and US, about 55 to 60% emerge as important of flows coming from these countries, as opposed to the other Luxembourg and Cyprus and other tax havens, which appear important in the FDI data. Right. So now China. So China, it's a well-known story about China and Hong Kong, and I think one country where we do find, of course, 1/3 of round tripping is estimated to come from Hong Kong, and that's what you see there in FDI data. And within the tax havens, British Virgin Islands seems to be the most favorite spot, about 70% or so going into China. Now, when we look at M&As, we want to see whether it's a very different pattern. Interestingly, we still find Hong Kong to be about 45%. So this is not exactly consistent with finding a different set of countries in terms of M&As, but Hong Kong also seems to be a large outward investor into China. So I mean, a large degree of this is round tripping. We understand that, but also at the same time, even M&A data shows that Hong Kong retains a very dominant share. So that's a point to note, and also to peruse further. But also, in addition to Hong Kong, we have countries like Singapore and UK coming up with better shares in terms of investments into China, right? So that's a point. So now, where are we right now in terms of what have we found from the basic data digging? What we found is for each emerging market like BRICS, for Brazil, Russia, India, China, we have a share of sort of OFCs and tax havens representing a disproportionate share, or a very significant share rather, of FDI flows into these countries. So it limits the usefulness to understand the bilateral linkages, especially if you want to understand from a policy making perspective, if you want to know more about who's doing the investing, well, then this is not going to be of any help or much help. So you want to we are proposing to examine M&A data with all the caveats, and it does track the actual ownership, and we find a far more informative geographic breakdown. We also, of course, we have to keep in mind all the caveats. Like I said, some of the FDI data from the FDI from these OFCs is round tripping back to the host country, so which implies that they're not fully comparable. But and despite the caution that is required, it will still provide us some indicative evidence. But what does this mean for policy, and why is this also useful to think through even more? Well, if you think about this, are these FDI inflows really foreign in the first place? I mean, is it a misnomer to call them foreign? Because it may look like domestic investments escaping the local taxation and then going out and then coming back and round tripping back to the country. So they're not really foreign in that sense. And there is a very high degree of correlation, like we saw in Russia's case. There is information about other countries as well. So we can actually look at the data much more closely to find that there could be serious issue of round tripping, and if we actually guesstimate what is really going on in these countries, we'll be able to get a sense of whether these flows are actually foreign in nature. Of course, this is important also from a taxation perspective from the host country. And I think there's been a lot of talk about, I'm not a legal expert here, but I know that there has been discussions going on about renegotiations of the double taxation avoidance agreements with Cyprus and Mauritius, and because they want to incorporate the limit of benefit clauses that will avoid, or that will rather prevent round tripping significantly. And which has also been cited as one of the reasons why we observe a greater shift of FDI inflows from Mauritius to Singapore. That's a point to note. And to go back to the point that Kishan had emphasized a lot earlier, does the type of FDI really matter? I mean, do we have to pay attention to greenfield versus M&A? Because given that the macroeconomic implications are so different for these countries, it's not very straightforward in the case of M&As, and where we may not actually see domestic capacity being augmented at all levels. Just the traditional, out of time. It's okay. So given that the traditional, benefits associated with FDI are not the same as applicable to as to M&As as such. So we need to make a distinction between greenfield and M&A, and we need to see whether the quality also matters as much as the quantity, right? And so more attention needs to be paid to that aspect of policy. And this point, I think he already talked about in terms of DIPP now suggesting that it's okay to allow 100% in greenfield in certain sectors like pharma, but only 49% for M&A. I think what we are trying to get at is that it is such a piecemeal approach in terms of to restrictions by imposing ownership restrictions may not be desirable per se. It may be useful to take a holistic perspective on greenfield versus M&A and understand what are the implications of each, and then formulate policies based on what comes out of it. And in fact, in this case, I think it's instructive to note that China has been following this CFIUS type arrangement, at which I think where they do analyze or examine each kind of M&A into strategic sectors and whether they can allow them or not, and so that is sort of a model for India and other countries to follow if you are going to be allowing greater M&As into your country. Whether it's wise enough to do that or not is something that to think about. So I think on the whole, I think we are saying that the FDI should be aligned with national objectives and development objectives, and it lacks a kind of strategic orientation when you don't think through the different types of FDI, and all you think about is just the quantum and the quantity of FDI. So, and one of the issues that we were trying to think through was if you want to be circumspect about M&As and coming into the country, probably what you can do is to think about, bolt down this particular form of M&A to contribute to research and development, by which means we can say that this is definitely augmenting some domestic capacity in some form or the other. So those are some of the regulatory issues to think about in terms of inviting, thinking about FDI and M&A. I think Kishan may want to add before I.
If you don't mind. Just if you go back to and this is sort of the policy conclusions, it's something we would like to discuss, but a few things here. So even countries like US, to a lesser extent Germany, when it comes to at least US, which I'm more familiar with, when they think about M&A, so they're open to greenfield FDI in a lot of areas, but in the case of mergers and acquisitions, change of ownership internationally, they have the Committee for Foreign Investment in the US, which potentially could look at all deals and if some deals where foreigners want to buy majority stake, the US Senate, Congress, whatever, could potentially block it if they think that it's not in the country's best or strategic interests. China, interestingly, hasn't actually implemented, but they're looking very closely at the CFIUS kind of thing. So being open to greenfield, but be a bit more circumspect about M&A. We're not sure that necessarily the CFIUS is the right way to go for a country like India, but I think a deeper level of thinking about the kind of FDI is important. Think about what's happened with the pharma industry. On the one hand, the new government comes in and says, oh, well, we're very open to FDI. India, look at our regulations. We have one of the most open FDI regimes in the world. Then you have DIPP coming out and saying, oh, well, maybe we have 74%, 100% in greenfield in pharma, 74% on the books M&A ownership, but maybe we should think about 49%. So that's creating a lot of uncertainty in the minds of investors. Yes, it's open, but now you're saying, well, maybe we should think about reducing or closing it somewhat. I'm not a great fan of thinking about separate ownership stakes for the same kind of investment, same sector. But so that's where we were thinking about, well, if you were to think about this a bit more systematically, you'd say, well, many areas, non-strategic, should be fairly laissez-faire, open to both greenfield and mergers and acquisitions. Some areas, obviously, like defense, in both areas, you have to be much more careful about the type of allowing for foreign ownership. I'm not saying zero, but one has to be a bit more careful. There are other areas like banking, where there are fairly strong domestic regulations, right? Banking, you have all these regulations to try and promote financial inclusion in terms of new banks. Banks have to hold certain proportion of their assets must be in terms of government bonds. You should be focusing on the agriculture rural sector, etc. There are fairly strong regulations in place. So both for foreign owners as well as domestic owners, those regulations still hold. Okay? So banking sector is actually good in that sense, and they should be more open to FDI, especially greenfield FDI. The problem is sectors like healthcare and pharma, where they're important from a development perspective, basic health, generic drugs, etc. But domestic regulations are actually fairly weak on pharmaceutical industries, both domestic and therefore foreign as well. There are no real regulations as such. And so here we're thinking, well, maybe greenfield FDI, fine, fairly laissez-faire. But in the case of M&A, think about how you allow for M&A, but rather than say only 49%, think about how M&A could contribute to the development objective as well. So if under the guise of people in India will say, oh, well, because of WTO regulations, our hands are tied. That's nonsense. A lot of other emerging economies, China, Brazil, yeah, they're signatories to WTO in these areas, but they're much more innovative in the kinds of policies that they implement to serve their own domestic purposes, right? And so we're not saying laissez-faire versus not. I'm not saying be socialist about this, regulate. I'm saying think about how allow M&A to come in, don't restrict it, but think about how it can serve your own domestic development agenda as well. I don't think India thinks deeply enough about these things. The elite in India too often say, oh, well, we can't do anything. It's the WTO, okay? And so this is very open to debate. We're not saying we have the final word on this. You want to talk just final point about future research and stuff, given that this is a thing there?
Yeah, so I think where we are heading from here is, like Kishan started off talking about, there are two strands of research. So one of that is looking at determinants of FDI as such. So now that we've been emphasizing a lot on the importance of breaking down FDI into greenfield and M&A, we thought it would be interesting. Not much work exists on determinants of, looking at the determinants of both these components or distinguishing these components. And surprisingly, actually, we did find that there's actually monthly data available, so which permits us to do a kind of a time series analysis on both on equity flows, especially from RBI, and we have the M&A data from the proprietary sources like Dealogic from 2002 onwards. So that actually gives us a nice time series to engage in some sort of empirical work on determinants of greenfield and M&As to see how different they are, and whether all the point about that they're qualitatively different can also be probed empirically as such. So that's one area we are going towards. And another one is also the issue of stability of different types of capital flow. So we're interested in examining closely about the relative stability and economic effects of the different types of FDI, because given the emphasis is also always on the breakdown of FDI into different components, and also examining FDI inflows into India at the state level, which has been catching up right now, and I think it's an interesting issue to look at. So these are future areas as we move forward along this direction. And we also want to do a fun paper on just guesstimating the extent of round tripping to BRICS. There are some papers that exist, one in 2004, and now we have something in 2013, something on Russia and one on China, but it'll be interesting to see if we can actually come up with some sort of guesstimates to come up with a ballpark figure about how much of it is actually round tripping back to India, and that's where we are heading. So thank you very much for having us here. So I'll take questions.